Hello, welcome back to lesson 2 of your new topic, which is radio, with a specific focus on the Radio 1 breakfast show. What you'll need today is your audit, which I asked you to do last lesson, which should look something a little bit like this, which is hopefully lovely and color-coded and gives me a good impression of what was going on in the show that you listened to. But also, you're going to need a expanding mind map. So, and in the middle, you're going to put this: what is Radio 1's role as a public service broadcaster? It's going to be a mind map, and the notes that you're going to make today are going to grow around it, and you'll keep adding to it as we go through these lessons. So at the end of the last lesson, I asked you to consider Radio 1's place as a public service broadcaster, given that it has a niche audience focus, which is 15 to 29-year-olds. How can it be said that the BBC is fulfilling its regulatory requirements by providing a broad reach to everybody in the nation? Obviously, I'm not able to get any feedback from you because this is a pre-recorded lesson, but I would be interested to hear if you thought that Radio 1 was unique in that it was the only radio station from the BBC. Of course, it's not. The BBC has 11 national radio stations, which really is huge. So quite aside from Radio 1, there is Radio 1 Extra, there is Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4. And remember, all of these have a different audience focus, a different demographic focus as well. Radio 5, which is sports and current affairs. Radio 4 Extra, comedy, drama, books, science fiction, etc. Radio 1 Dance, which is a new digital channel. There's 5 Live, Sports Extra. Radio 6, which is independent music. And there's a BBC Asian network as well. And this is quite aside from the national radio station, the regional, the national radio stations. So there's Radio Wales, there's Radio Scotland, Northern Ireland as well. And there's local services as well. And that is quite aside from the BBC World Service. So as you can see, there are many offerings that the BBC give to fulfil their Ofcom values and regulations to suggest that they are fulfilling their obligations to each member of their audience by having a variety of listening platforms that they can say that, okay, you can go to Radio 4 if you're wanting some more highbrow comedy, or you can go for Radio 2 for some more familial chat in the afternoon, or you can go to 5 Live if you want sport. But if you want to hear new music from UK-based audiences, and if you particularly like live music, then Radio 1 is the place for you. Conversely, if you're interested in documentaries which engage people of your age, maybe about social media or mental health or bullying or internet problems, then Radio 1 is also the place for you. They have to do 40 documentaries each year in order to fulfill their own targets in fulfilling their audiences. So it's really important that you understand that Radio 1 is part of a bigger picture. Remember, we're going from macro to micro. 90% of people listen to the radio. They have a choice of which radio station to listen to, and they're going to gravitate towards the one which has the best representation for them. Now, whether you know this or not, I'm not sure, but most radio stations have a playlist, and Radio 1 is no different. So this is the playlist for the week beginning Friday the 18th of December 2020. You'll see some big names up there: Billie Eilish, Ed Sheeran, Medusa, Taylor Swift. That's all in the A list. Going down into the B list, Eric Prydz, Pale Waves, Sam Fender, Up. And then C list, you've got some people who I have never heard of. There's also introducing playlist, and a tune of the weekend as well. So what that means in reality is this: the playlist is what is going to be played most regularly on a daily basis. So there's about 40 records each week. The A list gets about 25 plays a week. The B list is about 15, and the C list about 8 to 10 plays per week across Radio 1. So they're partly guided by what's already popular. So they'll be looking at other commercial radio stations and seeing what they're playing, but also looking at the top 40 and the download lists. But it's quite restrictive, and with only 40 records each week. I mean, this is not the full list. Obviously, DJs have the final decision on what gets played. And actually, what's interesting about the Radio 1 Breakfast Show is that Greg James often has a 10-minute takeover where the audience, where you or I can ring in and decide what the 3 songs to play in the 10-minute period every morning. So that's quite a important part. What is also important is that this does reflect the nature of the audience of the Radio 1 Breakfast Show. So they are the under 30s, and therefore you're not going to get songs from the early noughties or from the 90s, etc. If you do want that, well, you go ahead and you head to Radio 2 or you head to Radio 6. What's quite important to recognize as well, if you turn on other commercial radio stations, they are very likely to be their playlist is a lot narrower than the BBC's playlist. So they may only have a playlist of 20 records a week. Why? Because there will be a homogenized playlist of the songs that they know that will attract people to their radio station. So these songs will be repeated again and again and again, because remember, fundamentally for a commercial radio station, they need to be keeping people listening so they can listen to their adverts, which will then drive revenues, which will then keep them in business. It is different for Radio 1 because they are funded by the license fee, and therefore they don't have the restrictions of only having a very small playlist. They can have a broader playlist which incorporates worldwide music, but also music from new and upcoming British artists. So this is the Brit list, and this helps feature and push British artists, and to make a less globally homogenous playlist, which a lot of the other commercial radio stations have. Your first task of the day is to start to think, based on the research that you've done already, and based on the audit that you've done already, and the knowledge that you've acquired in these couple of lessons. I'd like you to write for about 10 minutes now and consider this question. Can Radio 1 afford to lose listeners? Over the next couple of lessons, we'll be talking a lot about listenership and the Rajar statistics, and considering how many people listen to the radio station and how people are affected by it. The presenters do get personally involved, as you would if you found out that you've lost 1 million listeners over a 3-month period. You're going to take it to heart. So the question is this: can Radio 1 afford to lose listeners? And while you're thinking about this question, you might want to consider a couple of things that we've spoken about over the past couple of lessons. Think about how it's funded. It's a different funding structure to a commercial radio station. So does that matter? If you think that they can afford to lose listeners because they've been funded in a particular way, essentially they've got a license fee, you have to pay that fee anyway, so they can afford to play jazz a bit, they can afford to take risks. If that is the case and you believe that, then why would they change the presenter in 2018 from Nick Grimshaw to Greg James? That seems like a bit of a contradiction, but maybe you'd like to try and explain that. I've given you a focus here, if you like, so perhaps it can afford some losses, but it can't afford a decline in quality and brand reputation. So that might be something that you'd like to consider to start off with your argument. So I'll leave this with you now, about 10 minutes of writing, see what you come up with. So hopefully you've done okay with that question. I've asked you to dig quite deep there to consider the impact, the sort of political impact of the funding structure of the BBC, but also what their outputs are and can they afford to lose listeners. So it's a difficult question, I appreciate that, but hopefully you've taken into account how it is funded, the quality of the programming, but also the regulation as well. Ofcom regulate the BBC, and they say that it needs to provide a certain amount of quality and content, and as a result of that, it can't afford to be blasé or too risky with its approach. So back to your mind maps, please, and we need to talk about why the license fee and the public service broadcasting debate is such a controversial one. Well, anything that you pay for is going to obviously come is going to be a source of argument, because if you don't think you're getting value for money, you're not going to pay for it. However, the license fee is different because it is a legal requirement for you to pay it. If you watch your TV, or you listen to radio, or you listen to a podcast by the BBC, having not paid the license fee, you are breaking the law. So we pay for it, and therefore people believe that we should have more say in the programs that are produced. I imagine you guys very rarely watch linear TV, and maybe the last time you never watched EastEnders, for example. So you might argue that it doesn't satisfy your desires and your wishes as a consumer of the BBC. Some people say that listening to the Radio 1 breakfast show when Sam Fender is messing on and guessing the age of a random child isn't necessarily a good of £154.40 a year. However, the BBC is a public service broadcaster, so they must produce programmes that benefit the public as a whole. That means if you're a 7-year-old, there needs to be something for you to turn the TV on and say, oh, that's a really good programme on CBeebies. And similarly, if you're a 70-year-old, you need to turn the radio on and you get Gardener's Question Time. You need, within the media sphere of the BBC, there needs to be something to fulfil everybody, which is then obviously a difficult task to do, and quite a challenging one. Crucially, it's not owned by the state, it's not government funded, it's not a political station, it doesn't support the Tories or the Labour Party, and that can lead to some pretty interesting commentary, because when you are dealing with politics, when you're dealing with the news, to remain impartial is extremely challenging, and the BBC has been accused of not being impartial, of being biased on multiple occasions. So it's not driven by politics. It's not driven by commercial interests, so it doesn't need to make more. It doesn't need to have more listeners because their revenue is guaranteed. It doesn't need to make money because it already has its revenue stream guaranteed. So it makes it unfair, arguably, that it's not the same as ITV, it's not the same as Channel 4. It doesn't have the same commercial pressures as those other companies do. So that's another reason why it's a potential hot topic of debate, because it's operating in an unfair, according to some, an unfair media sphere where it doesn't have the same commercial pressures. And fundamentally, if you think that the one show is utter garbage and you can't stand Alex Jones, and you think that the whole concept of sitting down and talking for half an hour at 7 o'clock is completely alien and a waste of resource, then it doesn't inform you, it doesn't educate you, and it doesn't entertain you, and therefore it's not satisfying these Reithian values. So that's another reason why one may choose to take umbrage with the BBC. So as I've mentioned there, it's because it's funded through the license fee, it does not rely on ratings and revenue for its survival. This is Radio 1 we're talking about. So what does it have to do then? If it doesn't have to make money, doesn't have to make more listeners, it does have to do these 6 things. It has to be impartial, and it has to give impartial news and information. It has to be educational. It has to provide high quality, distinctive programming. It has to reflect, represent, and serve all communities across Britain. This is the BBC as a whole. It has to support creative industries, and it has to reflect the UK and its values to the world. So whereas it doesn't have the same commercial restrictions that other commercial entities have, it does have these 6 rather strict regulations to abide by. So go ahead, put these 6 onto your growing mind map, and put your answer that I asked you to do earlier on in the lesson onto a blog as well. More lessons to come. Thanks very much.